They lowered an empty casket into Georgia red clay, while gospel hymns filled the air, and my husband wept crocodile tears into his silk handkerchief. 6 weeks later, 6 weeks, he stood at another altar, slipping a diamond ring onto my best friend's finger, whispering vows that should have been mine alone. But here's what they didn't know: I didn't die in that crash. I clawed my way back from the edge of oblivion, scarred and reborn, and when I stepped through those chapel doors on their wedding day, alive and draped in black like the ghost they tried to bury, her scream didn't just fill that room. It shattered everything they'd built on my grave. Before I take you back to that moment, before I show you the look on his face when death walked into his second chance at happiness, I need to pause here. I'm so glad you found your way to my story. If you're listening to this tale of betrayal and resurrection, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. And please, tell me in the comments where you're hearing this from, what city, what country, what corner of the world my story of revenge has reached. I need to know how far the truth can travel when it refuses to stay buried. Now, let me take you back to that Saturday afternoon in Atlanta. My name is Clara Winters. I'm 52 years old. And on September 14th, I walked into my own funeral, except they were calling it a wedding. The Grand Magnolia Ballroom. You know the kind of place where Atlanta's black elite gather to see and be seen, where old money meets new wealth under crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's houses. Every detail whispered prestige. Ivory roses cascading from 20-foot pedestals, golden drapes framing floor-to-ceiling windows, mahogany floors polished to a mirror shine that reflected the faces of 300 guests dressed in their finest. Gospel strings hummed through hidden speakers, something contemporary and soulful, the kind of arrangement that makes you close your eyes and sway even when your heart is breaking. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the rustle of silk, the murmur of conversation punctuated by champagne flutes clinking, by laughter that came easy when you didn't know the truth. And there, at the front beneath an arch woven with white lilies, my favorite flower, the ones I'd carried at my own wedding 23 years ago, stood Daniel. My Daniel, 55 and still devastating in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo, salt and pepper hair cut sharp, that smile he'd perfected over decades of closing real estate deals and charming donors. He looked every inch the grieving widower who'd found love again, who deserved this second chance at happiness after such tragic loss. Beside him, draped in ivory lace and holding a bouquet of, God, the irony, white lilies, stood Tamara Martin. Tamara, who'd sat in my kitchen every Sunday morning for 15 years, drinking the coffee I brewed, eating the sweet potato biscuits I made from my grandmother's recipe. Tamara, who'd cried on my shoulder when her own marriage fell apart, who'd whispered, "You're the only real friend I have," while I held her through the wreckage. Tamara, who'd stood beside me at the ribbon cutting for the women's shelter I'd founded, who'd called me sister in front of cameras and crowds. Tamara, whose hand was now clasped in my husband's as the pastor asked if anyone had reason these two should not be wed. The guests were rapt, 300 pairs of eyes fixed on the couple, waiting for the kiss, the pronouncement, the moment they could erupt in applause and move to the reception where honey bourbon cocktails and she crab soup awaited. Outside, rain had started. I could hear it against the windows, a soft drumming that nobody else seemed to notice. That's when I pushed open the doors. The sound echoed, those heavy oak doors swinging wide, letting in a gust of wet September air that made the candles flicker, that carried in the smell of rain and earth and something darker. Something like justice. Every head turned. The gospel music didn't stop, but it might as well have. The silence was that complete, that absolute. 300 people holding their collective breath as a figure stepped through the entrance, tall, draped in a long black veil that dripped rainwater onto that perfect mahogany floor, a shawl covering shoulders that had once been smooth and unblemished. My heels clicked, each step deliberate, each step a declaration. I'm here. I'm real. I'm alive. The whisper started like wildfire. Who is that? Is that? It can't be.
She's dead.
We buried her. Oh my God. Oh my God. I watched Daniel's face transform. Confusion first, eyebrows drawing together, head tilting slightly as if he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. Then recognition, blooming like a bloodstain. His skin went gray beneath that expensive tan. His mouth opened, but nothing came out except a small, choked sound that might have been my name. But it was Tamara who truly gave me what I'd come for. Her bouquet slipped from her fingers, white lilies tumbling through the air in slow motion, petals scattering across the floor like small surrenders. Her perfectly painted lips parted. And then she screamed. Not a movie scream. Not some delicate gasp. A raw, primal sound of pure terror that started somewhere deep in her chest and tore through that elegant ballroom like a siren, like a wound opening, like the sound of every lie she'd ever told coming back to collect what it was owed. That scream silenced everything. And in that moment, in that perfect, terrible moment of recognition and reckoning, I smiled beneath my veil. They buried an empty coffin, but I was never the one who died. You're probably wondering, how did I survive? How did they think they'd gotten away with it? What happened in that crash? Hold on. Let me take you back to where this really began. 4 months before that wedding. Before the empty coffin. Before I became a ghost with a pulse. It was June 12th, a Saturday night that should have been a triumph. I was driving home alone on Highway 85, winding through Georgia countryside where Spanish moss hangs from oak trees like widow's lace and the darkness stretches thick between street lamps. My silver evening gown, the one I'd spent 3 weeks searching for, the one that made me feel like myself even at 52, rustled against the leather seats of my Mercedes. The radio played soft jazz, something smoky and low, and I hummed along because I was happy. God help me, I was actually happy. The Carter Foundation Gala had been perfect. 200 donors, $100,000 raised for the women's shelter. My shelter. The one I'd built from nothing but determination and late nights and the bone-deep belief that women deserved safe places to rebuild their shattered lives. I'd given the closing speech. Daniel hadn't come, some last-minute business deal, he'd said, kissing my forehead that morning with what I thought was genuine regret. But it was fine. I was used to standing alone in the spotlight. 23 years of marriage teaches you to celebrate your victory solo, to smile for the cameras without your husband's hand at the small of your back. My phone sat in the cup holder, buzzing intermittently with congratulations texts. Beautiful speech, Clara. You're an inspiration. The shelter couldn't exist without you. Each notification lit up the dark interior like a small celebration. I reached for it at a red light, scrolling through the messages, my heart still warm from the evening's success. That's when I saw it. Unknown number. No message. Just a photo. My thumb hovered over it for a moment, some instinct whispering, don't look, put it down, drive home. But curiosity is a stubborn thing. I tapped the screen. The image loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, like my life unraveling in real time. Daniel. My husband. Wearing the navy shirt I'd bought him for his birthday, the one he'd said was too casual for his business dinner. He was leaning back in a leather booth at what looked like the Velvet Room, that downtown lounge where jazz plays until 2 a.m, and the lighting is deliberately dim, deliberately intimate. His arm was draped across the back of the seat. His smile was the one I hadn't seen directed at me in years, loose, genuine, the kind that reaches the eyes. And pressed against his side, her head tilted toward his shoulder, her hand resting on his thigh, was Tamara. Tamara in that emerald dress she'd asked me to help her pick out last week. Tamara wearing the earrings I'd given her for her 50th birthday. Tamara looking at my husband the way she used to look at her ex-husband before he left her for someone younger, prettier, less complicated. Below the photo, a caption in clean white text. They look good together. My hands started shaking. Not trembling. Shaking, violent, uncontrollable movement that made the phone slip between my fingers. I caught it against my chest, but the image was burned into my retinas now, impossible to unsee. The light turned green. Horns blared behind me. I pressed the accelerator without thinking, without seeing, my vision blurring at the edges. 23 years. 2 miscarriages. A decade spent building his business while mine waited. Every dinner party where I played the perfect wife, Every fundraiser where I smiled through his flirtations with younger women. Every night I'd fallen asleep alone while he worked late. And Tamara. God, Tamara. My best friend. My sister in everything but blood. The woman I'd held through her divorce, whose rent I'd paid when she couldn't, who'd sat at my table every Sunday and called my house her sanctuary. They looked good together. The words echoed in my skull like a death knell. My foot pressed harder on the gas. 70 miles per hour. 80. The highway blurred into streaks of darkness and the occasional flash of reflective road signs. I didn't realize I was crying until the tears hit my lap, darkening the silver silk. My breathing came in short, sharp gasps that fogged the windshield. I should have pulled over. Should have stopped. Should have done anything but keep driving with shaking hands and tears streaming, and that image seared into my brain. But all I could think was how long. How many Sunday mornings had they sat across from me, passing the biscuits, laughing at my jokes, planning their secret meetings while I poured their coffee? How many times had Daniel kissed me goodbye and driven straight to her? How many times had she hugged me, called me sister, all while planning to take my place? I didn't see the curve coming. Didn't register that the road was bending sharp to the left until my tires hit the shoulder and gravel sprayed like gunfire against the undercarriage. I yanked the wheel. Too hard. Too fast. The car spun. Once, twice, the world becoming a carousel of dark trees and darker sky. My head cracked against something solid. The seatbelt bit into my chest. Metal screamed. Then headlights. Massive, blinding, too close. The semi-truck's horn was the last thing I heard before impact. A sound like the world ending, like Judgment Day arriving in chrome and steel. The Mercedes crumpled like paper. Glass exploded inward, 1,000 tiny diamonds shredding my skin. My head whipped forward, backward, sideways. Something warm ran down my face. Something vital broke inside my chest. The world tilted. Darkness rushed in from the edges, thick and absolute. My last coherent thought wasn't of Daniel or Tamara or even my own mortality. It was simpler than that. Quieter. I should have known. Then nothing. Just the sound of rain starting to fall on twisted metal, and somewhere far away, sirens screaming toward a woman they would declare dead before dawn. The rain fell like judgment that night. Heavy, relentless sheets that turned the crash site into a baptism of twisted metal and shattered glass. Emergency lights painted everything in alternating shades of red and blue. The crumpled Mercedes wrapped around an oak tree, the semi-truck jackknifed it across 2 lanes, the paramedics working frantically over something I would later learn was supposed to be me. But I wasn't there to see any of it. I was somewhere between life and death, my consciousness flickering like a candle in a hurricane while strangers decided my fate. Daniel arrived within the hour. I know because I've seen the footage. Local news caught him stepping out of his Bentley, his face a careful mask of devastated husband. He wore a dark suit, already prepared for mourning. Already dressed for the role he'd rehearsed. The police officer approached him with that particular gentleness they reserve for the bereaved. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat as he gestured toward the wreckage, his mouth forming words I can imagine. Severe impact, unsurvivable injuries, need you to identify. Daniel's expression never changed. Not quite blank, not quite grieving, just perfectly, unnaturally calm. The face of a man who'd been expecting this call, who'd perhaps been waiting for it. The coroner met them near the ambulance. A middle-aged black woman with tired eyes and a clipboard that contained what was left of my identity. She held up something small, something that caught the emergency lights and gleamed despite the rain. My wedding band. White gold, engraved with our wedding date, a detail only Daniel would know. Except this ring was charred, blackened, the metal warped from heat that should have come from a fire the crash never produced. Later, I would understand. Later, I would piece together how easy it is to burn a duplicate ring, to plant evidence at a scene when first responders are overwhelmed and the victim is unrecognizable. Later, I would learn that my husband had connections, a grateful fire chief whose career he'd saved, a medical examiner who owed him favors, a network of debts he'd spent years cultivating for exactly this moment. But that night in the rain, He simply nodded, slow and solemn, like a man accepting the unbearable. His shoulders slumped in what might have been relief disguised as grief. The officer placed a hand on his shoulder. The coroner made notes on her clipboard. And just like that, Clara Winters was declared dead at the scene. No body. No actual confirmation. Just a ring and a husband's nod, and the assumption that no one could survive that impact. They were right about one thing. I shouldn't have survived. But should and did are two very different words, and mine is a story written in the space between them. The funeral was 3 days later. Wednesday morning, because Daniel said I would have wanted something simple, something quick, something that didn't disrupt too many schedules. The audacity of that, speaking for a dead wife, while planning a future without her. Greater Faith Baptist Church was packed. Over 500 people, they said. The news cameras stationed outside captured every arrival, every tear, every perfectly composed expression of shock and sorrow. Atlanta's black elite turned out in force. Businessmen in charcoal suits, society women in elegant black, city council members and nonprofit directors, and everyone who'd ever shaken my hand at a gala. The casket was closed, of course. Mahogany and brass, draped in white roses, my favorite, though I wonder if Daniel actually remembered or if Tamara had reminded him. The program featured a photo of me from 2 years ago, smiling at some fundraiser, looking like a woman who had no idea her best friend was already circling her marriage like a vulture. Gospel hymns filled the sanctuary. His eye is on the sparrow. Precious Lord, take my hand. Beautiful, mournful, sung by the same choir that had performed at our wedding 23 years earlier. The irony was almost poetic. Daniel sat in the front pew, Tamara beside him. I've watched the footage a dozen times since, studying their faces frame by frame. He wore black Armani, a silk tie, his face arranged in studied grief. She wore black lace, tasteful, expensive, her hand resting on his arm in a gesture that could have been comfort, but looked more like possession. The cameras loved them, kept cutting back to their clasped hands, to the way she leaned into him during the eulogy, to how he squeezed her fingers when the pastor spoke about loss and love and life continuing. My own sister delivered a eulogy. She broke down twice, her voice cracking over words about my generosity, my strength, my dedication to helping women rebuild their lives. Daniel dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief. Tamara's shoulders shook with what everyone assumed were sobs. But I know now what I couldn't see then. They weren't crying. They were performing. Every tear calculated, every trembling lip rehearsed, every embrace captured for an audience that ate up the narrative of tragic loss and beautiful solidarity. The pastor spoke about heaven, about reunions beyond this life, about trusting in God's plan even when we cannot understand it. People nodded, murmured amens, clutched their programs tight. And at the cemetery, under gray skies that threatened more rain, they lowered the casket into the ground. Into that red Georgia clay that's received generations of bodies, generations of secrets. Gospel singers hummed Amazing Grace, while Daniel threw the first handful of dirt, his ring glinting in the weak sunlight, his face finally, briefly, allowing itself a small smile. Because he thought he'd won. They both did. They buried an empty box filled with weights to mimic a body's mass. They buried my clothes, some jewelry, the remnants of a life they'd decided to erase. They buried nothing real except their guilt, wrapped it in mahogany and brass, dressed it in roses and lies, and called it closure. But you can't bury what refuses to die. And I refused. God knows I refused. I woke up to the sound of seagulls and the rhythmic beeping of machines I didn't recognize. For a long time, minutes, maybe hours, I couldn't move. Couldn't think beyond the immediate sensations, pain radiating through every nerve ending, the weight of bandages wrapped around my head and torso, the chemical smell of antiseptic mixing with salt air. My eyelids felt sewn shut, my throat scraped raw like I'd swallowed broken glass. When I finally managed to open my eyes, the world came into focus slowly. White ceiling tiles. A small window showing palmetto trees swaying against pale blue sky. Medical equipment that looked older than it should be, the kind you'd find in rural clinics that operate on prayer and donated supplies. This wasn't Piedmont Hospital. This wasn't any place Daniel's insurance would have sent me. A woman's face appeared above me. Dark skin, silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, eyes that had seen too much suffering to be shocked by anything anymore. She wore scrubs patterned with tiny shells, and when she spoke, her voice carried the soft lilt of Gullah Geechee country. "You're awake. Thank the Lord." She pressed a button, checked something on the monitor. "Don't try to talk yet. Your throat's been through trauma." But I had to know, had to understand. I forced sound through my damaged vocal cords, a rasp that barely qualified as speech. Where am I? St. Helena Coastal Clinic, about 40 miles south of Savannah. She adjusted my pillow with practiced gentleness. "You've been here 6 weeks, sugar. In and out of consciousness, mostly out. We weren't sure you'd make it." 6 weeks. The words hit like a second impact. 6 weeks of lost time, of absence, of... How did I couldn't finish the question. Couldn't reconcile the crash on Highway 85 with waking up near the coast. Old Man Rutledge found you. Fisherman who works the marshes near Tybee Island. Says you washed up on the bank like Jonah from the whale, half drowned, barely breathing, covered in blood and marsh mud. She checked my four with the efficiency of someone who'd performed this motion 10,000 times. Current must have carried you downstream after the crash. The Ogeechee River feeds into those marshes. He pulled you out, called 911, stayed with you until the ambulance came. I tried to piece it together through the fog. The crash. The rain. The way my car had hit the embankment near the river. I must have been thrown, ejected through the windshield maybe, or dragged by the current after crawling free. My memories were fragments, sharp edges in dark water. My husband. My voice cracked on the word. Does he know? Did anyone call? Something flickered across the nurse's face. Not quite pity, not quite discomfort. She busied herself with a blanket, tucking edges that didn't need tucking. "We called the number in your phone, the one marked IC. In case of emergency." She paused, her hands stilling. "A woman answered. She said she was handling your affairs. That there'd been a funeral. That we must have the wrong person because Clara Winters was already laid to rest." The room tilted. My heart monitor went wild, beeping frantically as my pulse skyrocketed. "Breathe, honey. Just breathe." The nurse's hand was cool on my forehead. "I know this is shocking. We couldn't understand it either. But we had your fingerprints, your dental records from the clinic database. You're definitely Clara Winters. But according to the death certificate filed in Fulton County, you died at the scene 4 weeks ago." 4 weeks ago. While I'd been in a coma, fighting for every breath. While I'd been lying in this coastal clinic that smelled of salt and survival. While my body had been knitting itself back together cell by painful cell. They'd declared me dead. Buried an empty casket. Moved on. The younger nurse who'd been lingering in the doorway finally stepped closer. She couldn't have been more than 25, with sympathetic eyes and hands that twisted nervously at her scrub top. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, like she was confessing something shameful. "Your husband, he already remarried." The words hung in the air like smoke, like poison. "What did you say?" My voice was stronger now, fueled by something beyond pain. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The young nurse's eyes glistened. "I looked it up online after we called. After that woman hung up on us. There were articles, photos. A society wedding 3 weeks after your funeral. Daniel Winters and Tamara Martin. They said it was love after loss. That they'd found comfort in shared grief. 3 weeks. 21 days after burying an empty casket, he'd slipped a ring on my best friend's finger. 21 days after gospel hymns and crocodile tears, they'd stood under an arch of flowers and promised forever. I asked for a mirror. The older nurse hesitated, exchanging glances with her colleague, but eventually she brought one, small, handheld, the kind used for checking stitches and drainage. "You've been through significant trauma," she warned. "The scarring will fade with time. Plastic surgery can help if. Just show me. My hand shook as I took the mirror. The woman looking back wasn't me.
Couldn't be me.
Her left cheek bore 3 long scars, still angry and red, running from temple to jaw like claw marks. Her eyes sat in hollows too deep, too haunted. Her lips were cracked and pale. Her hair, what was visible beneath the bandages, had gone dull, lifeless. But it was the expression that struck me most. This woman looked like she'd died and come back wrong. Like she'd seen the other side and brought something dark home with her. I traced the scars with trembling fingers, felt the raised tissue, the permanent reminder of metal and glass, and the night my husband tried to erase me. Maybe it's better this way, I whispered, studying that unfamiliar face. Maybe it's better if the world believes I'm gone. The nurses exchanged worried looks, but I barely noticed. I was too busy watching my reflection smile, slow and cold, and nothing like the woman I'd been. Clara Winters had died on Highway 85.
I was certain of that now.
But someone else was waking up in her place. Someone harder. Someone who'd learned exactly what she was capable of surviving. And someone who would make them wish they'd checked for a body before declaring victory. But survival is only the beginning. While I healed in that clinic, I started asking questions. Started digging. And what I discovered about the crash, about Daniel's finances, about Tamara's sudden interest in my charity, it would turn grief into something far more dangerous. 3 months after waking up, I could finally walk without assistance. My physical therapist, a patient woman named Joyce who never asked too many questions, would guide me down the clinic's narrow hallways, past rooms filled with other forgotten people, other souls the world had moved on from. My body was healing, bones knitting back together, muscles remembering their purpose, scars fading from angry red to pale pink. But my soul remained hollow, carved out by the knowledge that I'd been erased so easily, so completely. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I finally gathered the courage to search my own name. The clinic had a small recreation room with donated furniture and a handful of tablets for patients who had nowhere else to go, nothing else to do but wait for bodies to remember how to function. I sat in a threadbare armchair by the window, the borrowed device heavy in my lap, my finger hovering over the search bar for what felt like hours. Clara Winters. I typed it slowly, deliberately, like summoning a ghost. The results loaded. My obituary appeared first. Clara Marie Winters, 52, philanthropist and humanitarian, tragically killed in automobile accident, and beneath it, a cascade of articles that made my hands go numb. The first headline, Businessman Daniel Winters marries philanthropist Tamara Martin, love after loss. I clicked it. The screen filled with photos that felt like knives sliding between my ribs. Daniel and Tamara on the steps of City Hall, her in cream silk, him in a perfectly tailored gray suit. Both of them glowing with that particular radiance of people who'd gotten away with something. The article gushed about their whirlwind romance, about how grief had brought them together, how my death had revealed the love that had always existed between them but remained unspoken out of respect for Clara's memory. Respect for my memory. The phrase made me want to laugh, but my throat was too tight. I scrolled further. More photos. Tamara, wearing a necklace I recognized, white gold with a sapphire pendant, the one Daniel had given me for our 20th anniversary. Her hand on his chest, displaying the ring, the diamond catching sunlight in a way that felt obscene. Then I saw it, the thing that made my vision go white at the edges. They were standing in front of my house. The Craftsman bungalow in Virginia Highland that I'd spent 2 years renovating, choosing every paint color, every light fixture, every piece of crown molding. The home I designed as a sanctuary, a place where I could breathe after long days of carrying other people's trauma. Tamara had planted new flowers in the boxes I'd built, changed the welcome mat, added a wreath to the door, one of those expensive designer things from the boutique on Highland Avenue. The caption read, "The newlyweds in front of their Virginia Highland home." Their home. Not my home. Not even Daniel's home. Theirs. I kept scrolling, my breath coming faster now, my heart hammering against my still healing ribs. Another article. This one from the Atlanta Business Chronicle. Carter Women's Foundation restructured under new leadership. The foundation. My foundation. The organization I'd built from nothing, spending 5 years writing grants, courting donors, converting an abandoned warehouse into a safe haven for women fleeing violence. The place that carried my grandmother's maiden name because she'd been the one who taught me that strength was measured in survival. The article explained that, in the wake of founder Clara Winter's tragic passing, the board had voted to restructure. New mission statement, new branding, and a new name. The Tamara Martin Initiative for Women's Empowerment. I read that line 3 times, certain I'd misunderstood. But there it was, permanent and published. My grandmother's legacy erased. My 5 years of work rebranded. Everything I'd built, repurposed under the name of the woman who'd stolen my husband while I was still breathing. The photos showed Tamara at the ribbon cutting for the newly renovated facility. She wore one of my suits. I recognized it immediately, a burgundy Armani I'd bought for a particularly important donor meeting. She stood at a podium I'd commissioned, in a building I'd saved from demolition, smiling for cameras while Daniel stood proudly beside her. The logo on the banner behind them was new, professional, expensive, the kind of rebranding that cost tens of thousands of dollars. And there, printed on every surface, embroidered on every staff member's polo shirt, was Tamara's name where mine should have been. They didn't just move on. I whispered to the empty room, my voice steady now, cold. They used my ashes to build their kingdom. I kept searching, clicking through article after article, each one revealing another layer of theft. Tamara had taken over my seat on 3 nonprofit boards. She'd assumed my role as keynote speaker at the annual charity ball. She'd even written an editorial about honoring Clara's legacy while systematically erasing every trace of my actual existence. And Daniel, Daniel was listed as a major donor to the renamed foundation, generous contributions made in memory of his late wife. Tax write-offs purchased with money he'd probably stolen from our joint accounts. Public grieving that doubled as financial maneuvering. I found their wedding registry. They'd asked for donations to the Tamara Martin Initiative instead of gifts.
Brilliant, really.
Turn their celebration into another opportunity to cement her name over mine, to redirect the sympathy meant for my death into support for her ambition. There were society page photos, them at galas, at gallery openings, at the country club where I'd never quite felt comfortable but had attended anyway because that's what wives did. Tamara fits seamlessly into the spaces I'd occupied, wearing my jewelry, living in my house, running my charity, sleeping in my bed. She'd become me. Or rather, she'd become the version of me she'd always envied. The one married to Daniel, the one with access to his money and connections, the one whose name appeared in the paper for reasons beyond her own merit. My breathing steadied. That hollowness in my chest began to fill with something else. Something harder than grief, sharper than anger. Something that felt almost like purpose. I looked down at my scarred hands, at the tablet screen glowing with evidence of their betrayal. The flicker in my eyes changed. I could feel it, the shift from victim to something else entirely. From the woman who died on Highway 85 to the one who'd crawled out of marsh water with a new face and nothing left to lose.
They thought they'd buried me.
Thought they'd taken everything. My husband, my home, my life's work, my very identity, and gotten away clean. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd left me alive. And alive meant dangerous. Alive meant patient. Alive meant capable of watching, waiting, planning. I saved every article, every photo, every piece of evidence to a folder on the tablet. Documentation of a theft so complete, so audacious, that it would have been impressive if it wasn't my entire existence they'd stolen. Joyce appeared in the doorway, her expression concerned. "Clara? You've been in here for hours. You okay?" I looked up at her, and I must have been smiling because she took a small step backward. "I'm fine," I said, my voice clear and certain for the first time in months. "Actually, I'm better than fine. I finally know what I'm fighting for." I left the clinic on a Thursday morning in September, 4 months after the crash that should have killed me. Joyce hugged me goodbye with tears in her eyes, pressed a small envelope of cash into my palm. Donations from the staff, she said, for a fresh start. I thanked her without telling her the truth. I wasn't starting fresh. I was starting over, and there's a profound difference between the two. The first thing I needed was a name. Clara Winters was buried in red Georgia clay. She needed to stay there. Elena Ward. I chose it carefully, common enough to be forgettable, different enough that I wouldn't hesitate when someone called it. Elena had been my grandmother's middle name, the one she'd used when she'd left an abusive husband and rebuilt her life in a new city. Ward was my mother's maiden name, carried by women who'd learned that survival sometimes requires reinvention. The paperwork was easier than it should have been. A helpful clerk at a nonprofit that assisted domestic violence survivors, one I'd once donated to as Clara, didn't ask too many questions when I came in with my scarred face and trembling hands, claiming I needed to disappear from an abusive ex-husband. She helped me navigate the bureaucracy of becoming someone new, a driver's license, a bank account, a social security card for a woman who existed on paper but not in anyone's memory. I rented a small apartment in Mechanicsville, an older black neighborhood on Atlanta's south side. The kind of place I'd once supported through the foundation, organizing donation drives and volunteer days, showing up in designer clothes to paint community centers and hand out school supplies. The kind of place Tamara would now drive past without even slowing down, her windows up, her doors locked, her eyes fixed on the gleaming towers of Buckhead where people like her belonged. My apartment was a studio on the third floor of a building that had seen better decades. Hardwood floors scarred by generations of feet. A kitchen barely large enough to turn around in. Windows that rattled when trucks passed. But it had something Clara's perfectly renovated bungalow never did, anonymity. Here, no one knew my name or cared about my story. I was just another middle-aged woman trying to survive in a city that ate the vulnerable for breakfast. I changed everything about myself that could be changed. Cut my hair short, dyed it a deep auburn that looked nothing like Clara's natural black. Bought reading glasses with thick frames that altered the shape of my face. Traded elegant posture for a slight hunch, the kind that comes from carrying too much weight for too long. Changed my voice, lowered it half an octave, softened the cultured diction I'd perfected over 20 years of fundraising galas, let my grandmother's Georgia country slip back into my vowels. When I looked in the mirror now, Elena Ward stared back. Not Clara. Not even a shadow of her. Just a woman the world had no reason to notice, which made her more dangerous than any version of me that had existed before. But transformation was only the first step. Information was the second. I started reaching out quietly to people from Clara's old life, people Daniel and Tamara wouldn't think to watch, wouldn't consider threats. The invisible ones. The staff. The vendors. The people who'd witnessed things while serving champagne or balancing ledgers or fixing cars. Marcus Henderson was first. He'd catered events for the foundation for 3 years, his soul food elegant enough for high society, authentic enough that it reminded me of Sunday dinners at my grandmother's table. I found him through the network of small businesses I'd once supported, called from a prepaid phone, asked if we could meet. We sat in his catering kitchen after hours, the smell of cornbread and collard greens still hanging in the air. He recognized me despite the changes. Something in my eyes, he said later, something that hair dye and glasses couldn't disguise. I knew something wasn't right, Marcus said, his voice low, glancing toward the door like Daniel might walk through it. At that last gala, the one the night you died, I saw Daniel leave early, maybe an hour after it started. And when I was packing up outside, I saw him in the parking lot. With Tamara. They were arguing, but not like people who were hiding something new. Like people who'd been together long enough to fight dirty. How long? My voice stayed steady. Elena's voice, not Clara's. At least a year, maybe more. I saw them at the Velvet Room twice before that night. Thought about telling you, but... He shook his head. People don't like the messenger, you know? And I had a business to protect. I didn't blame him. The world teaches us to look away, to protect ourselves first. I thanked him, added his testimony to the growing file in my mind. Patricia Chun was next. The accountant who'd handled the foundation's books for 2 years before suddenly being replaced by someone Daniel recommended. She met me at a coffee shop in Decatur, nervous, checking her phone obsessively. He moved money, Patricia said, stirring sugar into coffee she wouldn't drink. 3 days before your accident. Large transfers from your joint accounts into accounts I couldn't trace. And the foundation's reserve fund, the emergency money you'd been saving for 5 years?
Gone.
Transferred out the day after your funeral. I filed a report with the board, but suddenly I was let go. Told my services were no longer needed. How much? I asked. From your personal accounts? Nearly $200,000. From the foundation? Another $500,000. Enough to live very comfortably. Enough to start a new life. She met my eyes. Or to pay for one to end. The pieces were coming together, a puzzle built from theft and betrayal. But I still needed the final confirmation. The proof that what happened on Highway 85 wasn't an accident. I found Tommy Rodriguez in a small garage off Memorial Drive, the kind of place where mechanics still fix cars with their hands instead of computers. He'd serviced my Mercedes for 3 years, knew that car better than anyone. I told him I was an insurance investigator looking into Clara Winter's accident. Showed him a fake business card I'd had printed. Asked if he'd been the last person to work on the vehicle. Tommy's expression darkened. He wiped his hands on a rag that wouldn't get any cleaner, glanced toward the office where his boss sat oblivious. I told the police, he said quietly. They didn't want to hear it. Said I was trying to cover for bad maintenance. But I know what I saw in that wreckage. Tell me. I leaned closer. Those brakes weren't worn down. They were cut. Clean slices through the brake lines, done by someone who knew exactly where to cut for delayed failure. The kind of thing that works fine until you need to stop fast, until you're going 70 on a dark highway, and suddenly you've got nothing. My blood went cold. Not with shock. I'd suspected, but with the certainty of it. The confirmation that Daniel hadn't just wished me dead. He'd engineered it. You're sure? I asked. 20 years I've been doing this. I know the difference between worn and sabotaged. That car was murdered, and whoever was driving it was supposed to die. I thanked him, walked out into September heat that felt cold against my skin. Stood on the sidewalk as traffic rushed past, as the city moved around me like I was already a ghost. He didn't lose control that night. He gave me a car with cut brake lines and sent me driving into the dark. Probably watched the news, waited for confirmation, practiced his grieving husband face in the mirror. And Tamara? She was waiting. Had probably been waiting for months, maybe years. Waiting for me to be erased, so she could step into my life like it had always belonged to her. But they'd made one catastrophic miscalculation. I survived. And now I knew exactly what they'd done. Knowledge is power, but revenge requires precision. They thought they were safe, thought they'd covered every track. But I was about to teach them something Clara never could, that ghosts don't haunt randomly. They haunt with purpose. The haunting began on a Tuesday in October, exactly 1 week after I confirmed what they'd done. I started small.
Subtle.
The kind of thing that plants seeds of doubt without offering concrete evidence. Because the most effective torture isn't physical, it's the kind that makes you question your own sanity, that turns every shadow into a threat, every coincidence into a conspiracy. The first note arrived at Tamara's yoga studio. I'd watched her routine for 2 weeks, learning her schedule the way a predator learns the patterns of prey. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, 9:30 class, always arriving 15 minutes early to claim the same spot by the window. I slipped the envelope into her gym bag while she was in the locker room. Nothing dramatic. Just a small card in handwriting that looked almost like mine. I'd practiced for hours, matching the loops and curves of Clara's script. The green dress looked better on me. That was it. No signature. No explanation. Just a reference to the emerald dress she'd worn the night I saw that photo, the night everything shattered. I wasn't there to see her read it, but I heard about it later from the instructor, who knew her. How Tamara had gone pale, How her hands had trembled through the entire class, how she'd asked if anyone had been near her bag, her voice climbing toward hysteria. The calls started that same week. Late nights, always after midnight when sleep makes you vulnerable, when darkness amplifies every fear. I'd found their new number easily, still listed under Daniel's name, arrogant enough to believe dead wives couldn't reach through phone lines. I never spoke. Just let the silence stretch. Let them hear the sound of breathing that could have been anyone, could have been no one, could have been the woman they'd murdered coming back for what was owed. Tamara answered most nights. I could hear her voice changing over the weeks, from annoyed to frightened to something approaching panic. Who is this? What do you want? Stop calling here. Please just stop. That last word always broke, cracked down the middle like glass under pressure. I'd wait until her breathing got ragged, until I could almost see her gripping the phone with white knuckles, and then I'd hang up. Let the silence after be worse than the silence stirring. But the mirrors were my masterpiece. The thing that would make her question everything. I knew Tamara's routines intimately. Years of friendship had taught me where she shopped, which boutiques she frequented, which fitting rooms she preferred. Lenox Square on Saturday afternoons. Phipps Plaza on Wednesday evenings. The small designer consignment shop in Virginia Highland that she discovered through me, back when she used to ask my opinion on clothes she couldn't quite afford. I'd arrive early, dressed as Elena, invisible in my discount store clothes and thick-framed glasses. Wait in the adjacent fitting room or browse nearby racks. And when she'd step in front of those three-way mirrors, trying on dresses that cost more than most people's monthly rent, I'd position myself just right. Just a glimpse. A flash of movement in the peripheral vision. A woman with my build, my posture, wearing colors I used to favor. Never long enough for clear identification. Just enough to plant the seed. The first time, she froze mid-turn, staring at the mirror with her mouth slightly open. The saleswoman asked if everything was all right. Tamara had stammered something about the lighting, about feeling dizzy, about needing air. The second time, she called for the saleswoman, demanded to know who else was in the fitting area. But there was only Tamara, her paranoia, and me already gone. By the third time, she'd stopped trying on clothes altogether. Just clutched her purchases and hurried out, her head swiveling, her eyes searching every reflective surface like they might reveal the truth her mind refused to accept. Church was harder, but more devastating. Greater Faith Baptist, where they'd held my funeral, where Tamara now sat beside Daniel every Sunday morning, playing the role of devoted wife in the very pews where she'd pretended to mourn me. I'd slip in late, sit in the back in a hat and sunglasses, obscured by the crowd. Wait until the sermon reached its emotional peak, until everyone was focused forward. Then I'd lean close to whoever sat near Tamara and whisper, barely audible, just a breath of sound. Clara knows. I'd watch her spine go rigid, watch her head whip around, searching, finding nothing but innocent congregants focused on the pastor's words. The first time, she grabbed Daniel's arm, whispered frantically. He'd patted her hand dismissively, his expression annoyed. Told her she was hearing things, imagining it. But repetition is its own kind of proof. By the fourth Sunday, she refused to attend. Made excuses about migraines, about needing rest. Daniel went alone, his jaw tight with frustration, his perfect image cracking at the edges. He dismissed it all at first. Told Tamara she was being paranoid, ridiculous, that grief sometimes manifested as guilt. That the stress of the wedding, the foundation, the sudden scrutiny of their relationship was making her unstable. Until the morning he found it. I'd broken into his office. The gleaming high-rise downtown where Daniel Winter's development occupied the entire 20th floor. Security was expensive but predictable, and I'd spent 3 weeks learning the patterns. The night janitor, who propped the stairwell door. The guard who took his break at 2 a.m. to smoke. The gap in camera coverage near the executive bathrooms. I wore gloves. Left no traces except the ones I wanted found. His office mirror. The one behind his massive desk. The one where he'd probably practiced his grieving husband face, now bore a single mark. A perfect lipstick impression, the kind left by a kiss or a threat. Mahogany rose. My signature shade, the one I'd worn to every important event, the one I'd been wearing in the photo they'd used at my funeral. Next to it, written in the same lipstick, a note in Clara's handwriting. Some ghosts don't need graves. I'd placed it at eye level, impossible to miss. Waited across the street in a rented office space with binoculars, watching the windows of the 20th floor. Daniel arrived at 7:45 a.m., punctual as always. Disappeared into his office. I counted seconds, imagined him setting down his briefcase, turning toward his desk, seeing it. The lights in his office went off. Then on. Then off again, like he couldn't decide whether darkness or illumination was worse. He stood at the window for a long time after that, his silhouette rigid, his phone pressed to his ear. Probably calling building security, demanding explanations, getting none that satisfied. From across the street, through layers of glass and distance, I smiled. Not Clara's smile. Elena's. Harder, colder, carved from survival and rage. I wasn't haunting them. Not really. Ghosts haunt randomly, senselessly, without purpose beyond their own torment. But I had purpose. Had direction. Had a plan that extended far beyond anonymous notes and midnight phone calls. I was reminding them that I existed. That Clara Winters hadn't disappeared into highway darkness and river water. That every lie they'd told, every asset they'd stolen, every moment they'd spent building their kingdom on my grave, it had all been observed.
Documented.
Remembered. And soon, very soon, the haunting would end. Because ghosts eventually fade. But the living can testify. Can produce evidence. Can walk through doors they're not supposed to walk through and demand the accounting that death had denied them. I watched Daniel's shadow pace behind those 20th floor windows, watched the lights flicker on and off like a man trying to wake from a nightmare that wouldn't end. You should have checked for a body, I thought, packing up my binoculars, preparing to disappear back into Elena Ward's anonymous life. You should have made sure I was really gone. But hindsight is a luxury the guilty rarely afford themselves. And by the time they learned that lesson, it would be far too late. The psychological warfare was working, Tamara unraveling, Daniel's confidence shaking. But I needed more than their fear. I needed their confession. And for that, I'd have to give them exactly what they'd wanted from the beginning. Proof that I was really, finally, completely gone. The invitation arrived at my Mechanicsville apartment 3 weeks before the event, forwarded through a chain of old foundation contacts who thought Elena Ward might be interested in covering Atlanta's social event of the season for a fictitious, non-profit newsletter I'd invented. Daniel and Tamara Winters cordially invite you to witness the renewal of their wedding vows. 1 year. They'd waited exactly 1 year from their Rush City Hall ceremony to throw the lavish celebration they'd probably been planning since before my body went cold. The kind of event that announced to Atlanta's black elite, "We're legitimate now. We've survived the scandal. We're here to stay." The Grand Magnolia Ballroom. Saturday, September 14th. Black tie required. Reception to follow with donations benefiting the Tamara Martin Initiative, my foundation, wearing her name like a costume. I read that invitation 50 times, memorizing every detail. The embossed gold lettering. The tasteful ivory cardstock. The subtle arrogance of people who believed they'd won so completely that they could celebrate publicly, loudly, without fear of consequences. They thought I was gone. Thought the haunting had been paranoia, stress, the guilt-induced hallucinations of two people who knew what they'd done but convinced themselves they'd gotten away with it. They were about to learn that death has a cruel sense of timing. September 14th arrived with dark clouds and the promise of rain. Appropriate, I thought, standing in my small apartment, studying my reflection in the full-length mirror I'd bought specifically for this moment. I'd spent 3 months preparing. Not just gathering evidence, though I had that in abundance, stored on encrypted drives and in safety deposit boxes under Elena Ward's name. Not just planning my entrance, though I'd rehearsed it until every step felt inevitable, but preparing myself for what it meant to stop being Elena and become Clara again. The woman in the mirror wore black satin, a gown I'd commissioned from a seamstress in Little 5 Points who specialized in custom work and didn't ask questions. High-necked, long-sleeved, elegant enough for the venue but dark enough to signal that this wasn't celebration. The fabric caught the light like water, like the river that had carried me to survival. My hair, grown out over the past year, was styled simply. No more auburn dye. I'd returned to my natural black, threaded now with silver I hadn't noticed before the crash. The scars on my cheek were visible, deliberate. I'd refused makeup that might hide them. Let them see what survival looked like. Let them see what they'd created. I wore no jewelry except for one piece, my original wedding band, the one I'd been wearing the night of the crash, recovered from the wreckage by Tommy Rodriguez and returned to me with shaking hands. White gold, engraved with our wedding date, untouched by the fire that had supposedly consumed me. The woman looking back at me was neither Clara nor Elena. She was something new. Something forged in marsh water and hospital beds and long nights of planning revenge that felt more like justice. I smiled at my reflection. Let's go haunt a wedding. The Grand Magnolia Ballroom glowed like a beacon as I approached, my rideshare dropping me 2 blocks away so I could walk the final distance. Rain had started, a light drizzle that would become a downpour by evening, as if the sky itself was preparing for what came next. The building rose before me, all glass and gold light, the kind of venue where Atlanta's most powerful people gathered to see and be seen. Through the windows, I could see the crowd, 300 guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, champagne flutes catching light from crystal chandeliers, everyone performing the elaborate dance of high society. I'd been to dozens of events here as Clara. Fundraisers, galas, award ceremonies. I knew every entrance, every hallway, every place where security cameras had blind spots. I also knew that nobody checks the guest list too carefully at events this size, this prestigious. They assume if you're dressed right, if you carry yourself with enough confidence, you belong. Thunder rolled across the sky as I climbed the front steps. My heels clicked against marble. That same sound from my vision of this moment, the soundtrack to resurrection. The lobby was mostly empty, everyone already inside for the ceremony. A young woman at the welcome table looked up, smiled professionally. Good evening. Name please? Elena Ward, I said smoothly. I'm with the Carter Foundation documentation team. She scanned her tablet, found the fabricated entry I'd added to their system 3 days ago through methods I'd learned from a hacker I'd once helped escape an abusive relationship. Her smile brightened. Of course. Please go right in. The ceremony is just beginning. I thanked her, walked past, my heart steady.
No nerves now.
Just purpose. The ballroom doors stood before me. Tall, ornate oak that probably cost more than my first car. Beyond them, I could hear music. Gospel strings, something contemporary and soulful, the kind that made people sway and close their eyes. Through the small windows in the doors, I could see it all. Ivory roses everywhere, cascading from pedestals, woven into garlands, scattered across tables like expensive snow. Golden drapes framing windows that showed the darkening sky. Mahogany floors polished until they reflected the chandelier light like a mirror. And there, at the front beneath an arch of white lilies, stood Daniel and Tamara. He looked exactly as he had at our wedding 24 years ago. Older now, silver threading through his temples, but still commanding in his tuxedo. Still wearing that smile that had convinced me once that I was loved, that I was safe, that our future stretched bright and uncomplicated before us. Tamara glowed beside him. Her renewal gown was ivory lace and crystals, something that probably cost $50,000, cut to show off the figure she maintained through private trainers and boutique fitness classes. Her bouquet, white lilies again, always my flowers, trembled slightly in her hands. Were those tremors from joy? Or from the year of haunting, the sleepless nights, the growing certainty that something wasn't right even if she couldn't name it? The pastor stood before them, his Bible open, his voice carrying through the ballroom. We gather here today to celebrate the renewal of vows between Daniel and Tamara Winters. Thunder rolled again, louder now. Closer. Several guests glanced toward the windows where rain had started streaking the glass. I placed my hands on the door handles. Drew one long, steady breath. This is it. No turning back. The moment you stop being a ghost and become real again. The pastor continued, "Marriage is a sacred covenant, a bond that transcends." I pushed the doors open. The sound echoed, oak against marble, hinges creaking, a gust of rain-scented air rushing into the climate-controlled perfection of the ballroom. The kind of sound that makes every head turn, every conversation stop, every carefully curated moment shatter. 300 pairs of eyes found me. 300 breaths held simultaneously. The music didn't stop immediately. The strings kept playing for another few seconds, creating a surreal soundtrack as I stepped inside. Rainwater dripped from my shawl onto that perfect mahogany floor. My heels clicked, once, twice, 3 times, each step deliberate, each step a declaration. The whispers started like wildfire.
Who is that?
Why is she wearing black? Is that?
No, it can't be. She's dead.
We were at her funeral. Oh my God. Oh my God. I walked down the aisle between rows of guests who'd attended my funeral, who'd listened to eulogies about my generosity and strength, who'd watched Daniel and Tamara comfort each other in their grief. Their faces blurred past me. Shock, confusion, dawning recognition, horror. But I only had eyes for 2 people. Daniel saw me first. I watched his expression transform in real time. Confusion flickering across his features, his head tilting slightly like he couldn't process what his eyes were telling him. Then recognition bloomed like poison, draining the color from his face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Just a small, choked noise that might have been my name, or might have been prayer. The pastor had stopped speaking. The music finally died. Silence filled the ballroom like water, like drowning. And then Tamara turned. Followed Daniel's frozen stare. Saw me standing there, 20 feet away, real and solid and undeniably alive. Her bouquet slipped from her fingers. The white lilies fell in slow motion, petals scattering across the floor like small white flags of surrender. Her face went from radiant bride to something approaching catatonic shock, eyes wide, skin gray, mouth opening and closing without sound. Then she screamed. Not a delicate gasp. Not a movie-ready shriek. A raw, primal sound of pure terror that started somewhere deep in her chest and tore through that elegant ballroom like an alarm, like a siren, like the sound of every nightmare she'd been having for the past year made manifest and walking toward her in black satin. That scream silenced everything. Cut through the whispers, the shocked exclamations, the rustling of expensive fabric as 300 people half rose from their seats. I stopped at the end of the aisle. Let them look. Let them see the scars on my face, the silver in my hair, the wedding band on my finger that matched the one Daniel wore. Let them see what survival looked like.
I smiled then.
Not cruel, not victorious, just certain. The smile of a woman who'd crawled back from death to collect what was owed. Hello, Daniel, I said, my voice carrying in the absolute silence. Hello, Tamara. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Thunder crashed outside. Rain hammered against the windows. And in that moment, that perfect, terrible moment, I watched their kingdom crumble. They thought I was gone. But death, as I'd learned, has a cruel sense of timing. And mine had arrived right on schedule. The entrance was just the beginning. Now came the part I'd been rehearsing for a year. The accounting, the evidence, the moment when ghosts stop haunting and start testifying. I walked forward, deliberate. Each step echoing through the ballroom like a verdict being read, like judgment arriving on a schedule they hadn't anticipated. My heels struck that polished mahogany floor, click, 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 a rhythm that 300 people would remember for the rest of their lives. The guests remained frozen. Some had half risen from their seats, champagne flutes suspended in midair, mouths open in expressions that would have been comedic if they weren't so genuinely horrified. Cell phones emerged from clutches and jacket pockets. Of course they did. This was Atlanta society, where nothing existed until it was documented, shared, made viral. Let them record. Let them witness. That was the point. I reached the altar where Daniel and Tamara stood paralyzed beneath their arch of white lilies. The flowers I'd carried at my own wedding. The ones that symbolized purity, devotion, the promise of forever. The irony was almost too perfect. Tamara's legs gave out. She collapsed, catching herself on the altar railing, her expensive gown pooling around her like spilled milk. Her veil trembled, crystals catching the chandelier light in a way that might have been beautiful if it wasn't framing absolute terror. "Clara?" Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from screaming, trembling with disbelief. She said my name like a question, like maybe if she questioned hard enough, reality would rearrange itself into something manageable. Daniel found his voice next, though it came out broken, fractured. "You're dead." He shook his head, as if physical denial could unmake what stood before him. "You're dead. We buried you. I identified." "A ring." I interrupted, my voice calm, almost conversational. "You identified a charred wedding band. Tell me, Daniel, how difficult was it to burn a duplicate? How much did you pay the coroner to file that death certificate without examining an actual body?" His face went from gray to white. Someone in the crowd gasped. I smiled then. Just faintly. Just enough. "Then why do you look so afraid?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Like accusation. Like the beginning of an unraveling that had been a year in the making. I turned slightly, addressing not just them but the entire ballroom. 300 witnesses. 300 cameras recording. 300 people who would carry this story into every corner of Atlanta's social circles. "My name is Clara Winters," I said, projecting my voice the way I'd learned during years of fundraising speeches. "Some of you knew me. Many of you attended my funeral 14 months ago. You listened to beautiful eulogies. You watched my grieving husband accept condolences. You donated to the foundation that bore my grandmother's name." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I saw recognition dawning on faces, the ones who'd known me, who'd served on boards with me, who'd written checks to my causes while thinking I was safely buried. What you didn't know, what Daniel and Tamara didn't expect, was that I survived the crash. I gestured to the scars on my face, impossible to ignore in the bright ballroom lighting. I spent 6 weeks in a coma in a coastal clinic. When I finally woke, I discovered I'd been declared dead. My husband had remarried. My best friend had taken my place. My home, my foundation, my entire existence had been erased and redistributed. Camera flashes erupted like lightning. The pastor backed away slowly, Bible clutched to his chest, clearly calculating whether his presence at this ceremony would damage his reputation. "But it gets better," I continued, my voice steady, clinical. "The crash wasn't an accident. My brake lines were cut, confirmed by the mechanic who examined the wreckage. 3 days before the crash, Daniel transferred nearly $200,000 from our joint accounts into offshore accounts I couldn't trace. The day after my funeral, another $500,000 disappeared from the foundation's reserves." Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Guests looked at each other, at Daniel, at their phones where they were undoubtedly searching for lawyers, journalists, anyone who could confirm or deny this public dismantling. "Insurance fraud," I said, ticking off on my fingers. "Attempted murder. Forgery. The death certificate was signed by a coroner Daniel had done favors for. Embezzlement from a non-profit organization. Identity theft. And adultery, though that's almost quaint compared to the rest." Daniel finally found his full voice. "You're insane." But it came out desperate, not convincing. "You disappeared. You faked your death for attention for." "Then explain the brake lines, Daniel." My voice cut through his. "Explain the money transfers. Explain why you declared me dead within hours, without waiting for a body to be identified. Explain why you married Tamara 6 weeks after my funeral." He had no explanation, just a face that had finally cracked, that perfect mask shattering to reveal something desperate and cornered beneath. Tamara was sobbing now, uncontrollable, gasping sobs that shook her whole body. Mascara streamed down her face, turning her bridal makeup into something tragic, something that would photograph beautifully for the scandal that would dominate Atlanta society for years. I trusted you, I said, looking at her directly. I held you through your divorce, paid your rent, called you sister, and you repaid that by sleeping with my husband while I was still warm in our bed. I didn't know, Tamara started, but I raised a hand. Don't lie. Not here.
Not now.
You knew about the crash before it happened. I have phone records showing 17 calls between you and Daniel the week before I died. I have texts. I have witnesses who saw you together for over a year. You didn't just take advantage of my death, Tamara. You were waiting for it. The crowd's murmurs had become a roar. People were standing now, pointing, arguing, some demanding security, others demanding justice. This was no longer a vow renewal. It was a public execution. I stepped closer to Daniel and Tamara, close enough that only they could hear my next words beneath the chaos. You buried me alive, I whispered, my voice hard as stone. You cut my brakes, declared me dead, stole my life, and built your kingdom on my grave. And you almost got away with it. Almost. I let that word hang between us. Almost. Now you get to live with that sound. I continued, leaning even closer. The coffin lid closing. The dirt hitting wood. The knowledge that every time you close your eyes, every time you hear thunder or see rain, you'll remember the woman you tried to erase. And you'll wonder when she's coming back. Daniel's jaw trembled. Tamara had stopped sobbing, just stared at me with hollow, devastated eyes. I straightened, adjusted my shawl, and smiled at them one final time. Not cruel, not triumphant, just certain. Enjoy your reception, I said loudly enough for the nearest guest to hear. I hear the donations are going to a wonderful cause. My cause. The one I built with my own hands before it was stolen. Then I turned, walked back down that aisle through the chaos I'd created. Cameras flashed continuously now, guests shouting questions, some crying, some calling for police, some just standing in shock. I didn't look back. Didn't need to. Behind me, I could hear Tamara's renewed sobbing, Daniel's voice trying to explain, to justify, to salvage something from the wreckage. But some things, once broken, can never be repaired. I'd learned that the hard way. Now it was their turn. I pushed through the ballroom doors into the lobby. Rain still fell outside, harder now, drumming against the windows like applause. The young woman at the welcome table stared at me, phone in hand, clearly having heard everything. Have a blessed evening, I told her and walked out into the storm. Behind me, their perfect world collapsed. Ahead of me, the rain washed everything clean. And for the first time in 14 months, I felt like I could finally breathe. The headlines hit before I'd even made it back to Mechanicsville. By the time my rideshare dropped me at my apartment building, my phone, Elena Ward's cheap prepaid phone, was buzzing with news alerts I'd set up months ago. Any mention of Daniel Winters. Any mention of Tamara Martin. Any mention of Clara Winters rising from the dead like Lazarus in black satin. Dead. Wife returns to ex-husband's vow renewal. Atlanta society rocked by scandal. Clara Winters alive. Fraud investigation launched into death certificate. Insurance claims. Philanthropist's dramatic return exposes year-long deception. The story spread like wildfire through news sites, social media, group chats. Within hours, it had jumped from local Atlanta coverage to national networks. By morning, it would be international. The kind of story that had everything: wealth, betrayal, attempted murder, a woman returning from the dead to confront her killers at their own wedding. You couldn't write fiction this good. Reality had outdone every revenge fantasy ever committed to paper. I didn't go home immediately. Instead, I drove to a small motel off I-85, the kind that rents by the hour or the week, that doesn't ask questions as long as cash appears. The Starlight Motor Lodge, with its flickering neon sign and parking lot full of cars that had seen better decades. Room 17. Second floor. Window overlooking the highway where headlights streamed past like memories, going somewhere, going nowhere, just moving because stillness meant thinking and thinking meant facing what you become. I sat in the dark for a long time, still wearing the black satin gown, watching my phone light up with notifications. Watching the world I'd shattered continue to fracture in real time. The arrests came within 48 hours. Daniel first, led out of his office in handcuffs while news cameras captured every moment.
Fraud.
Embezzlement. Conspiracy to commit murder. The charges kept mounting as investigators dug deeper, finding layers of corruption I hadn't even uncovered. Apparently, trying to kill your wife opens the door for authorities to examine every corner of your life, and Daniel's life couldn't withstand that scrutiny. His company collapsed within a week. Investors fled. Contracts canceled. The gleaming office tower with his name on it went up for sale. 20 years of building an empire, demolished in days because he'd gotten greedy, gotten sloppy, gotten caught. Tamara wasn't arrested, not immediately. But she disappeared from public life so completely, it was almost like she'd died for real. The foundation shut down pending investigation. Her social media accounts went silent. The house in Virginia Highland, my house, went dark, curtains drawn, no one entering or leaving. Some people whispered she'd had a breakdown. Others said she'd fled the country. A few claimed they'd seen her at psychiatric facilities, grocery stores, airports. Ghost sightings of a woman who'd become a ghost herself. I watched it all from my motel room. Changed locations every few days. The Starlight to the Peachtree and to the Budget Lodge on Memorial Drive. Never staying long enough to be found. Never going far enough to lose track of the story. My reflection in these anonymous windows became increasingly unfamiliar. Not just the scars, not just the silver threading through my hair. Something in the eyes. Something that had been soft before the crash and had calcified during the long months of planning, plotting, preparing for the moment I'd just executed. I looked like someone who'd won. But winning felt hollow in ways I hadn't anticipated. On the bed of whatever motel I occupied that night, they all blurred together after a while, lay my wedding ring. The white gold band engraved with our wedding date, the one I'd worn during the confrontation, the one I'd taken off the moment I'd returned to privacy. I stared at it often. That small circle of metal that had once meant forever, that now meant nothing except evidence of a life that had ended on Highway 85 regardless of whether my body had. Clara Winters was dead. I'd killed her as surely as Daniel had tried to. Just more successfully. The question was, who had taken her place? Elena Ward was a disguise, a temporary identity. And this new version, scarred, hardened, capable of orchestrating public humiliation and legal destruction, she didn't have a name yet. 3 weeks after the wedding confrontation, I was staying at the Riverside Motel near the airport. Small room, thin walls. The sound of planes overhead every few minutes, carrying people to places where their lives made sense. I'd just returned from the corner store, frozen dinner, cheap wine, the sustenance of people who'd stopped caring about nourishment, when I noticed it. The door was closed, locked, chain engaged. But something felt different.
Wrong.
I stood in the dim light, my hand on the doorknob, every instinct screaming the way they should have screamed before I'd opened that photo on Highway 85. I didn't move, just waited, listening to my heartbeat, to traffic outside, to the hum of the ice machine down the hall. Then I saw it. A white envelope on the stained carpet, partially visible beneath the door. Someone had slid it through while I was gone, precise enough that it hadn't been there when I'd left. I still didn't move. Couldn't. Because that envelope meant someone knew where I was. Someone had tracked Elena Ward through multiple motels, multiple identities, multiple attempts to remain invisible. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Time felt strange lately, elastic and unreliable. Finally, I bent down. Picked up the envelope with hands that had stopped trembling months ago, that had learned steadiness the way soldiers learn to sleep through gunfire. The envelope was unmarked. Expensive paper, the kind that whispered money even before you opened it. Inside, a single card. Heavy stock. Handwritten message in unfamiliar script. It's not over. That was all. 3 words. No signature. No explanation. Just a promise or a threat or both. I looked toward the door.
Come.
Dangerous. The woman I'd become staring at the barrier between me and whoever had left this message. Part of me wanted to rip it open, to chase down the hallway, to confront whatever came next the way I'd confronted Daniel and Tamara. But another part, the part that had learned patience in hospital beds and revenge in anonymous apartments, knew better. Some storms announce themselves with thunder. Others just settle in your bones and wait. I walked to the window, looked out at the parking lot where anonymous cars sat beneath flickering lights. Somewhere out there, someone was watching. Someone who knew what I'd done, where I was, what I'd become. Daniel was in jail. Tamara was broken. The life they'd stolen had been returned, piece by fractured piece. But justice, I was learning, doesn't end with confrontation. It doesn't tie itself in neat bows. It bleeds into aftermath, into consequence, into the long years of living with what you've survived and what you've become in the process of survival. I held that card up to the dim light. It's not over.
No.
No, it wasn't. They thought death would silence me. Thought that cutting brake lines and filing false certificates and building kingdoms on graves would be enough to erase Clara Winters from the narrative of their lives. But some storms don't pass. They don't blow through and leave clear skies behind. They settle inside you, become part of your weather, turn you into the kind of person who can walk into wedding ceremonies and destroy lives with truth.
I was that storm now.
Had been since the moment I'd opened my eyes in that coastal clinic and decided that being dead was easier than coming back. Had been since I'd chosen Elena Ward over Clara Winters, revenge over recovery, justice over peace. And whoever had left that note, whoever was tracking me, threatening me, promising me that this story had more chapters, they were about to learn what Daniel and Tamara had learned too late. You don't hunt storms. You don't threaten them with unfinished business. Because storms don't run, don't hide, don't negotiate. They just keep moving.
Keep building.
Keep gathering strength until they're ready to break. I set the card on the nightstand, turned off the light, sat in darkness with my reflection barely visible in the window glass, a woman I didn't recognize wearing a life I hadn't chosen, but had learned to inhabit. Outside, thunder rolled. Real thunder this time, not metaphor. Rain began to fall. Gentle at first, then harder. The kind of rain that had been falling the night everything ended, and everything began. I smiled at my reflection. Not Clara's smile. Not Elena's either. Something new. Something dangerous. Something that understood the difference between surviving and living, and had chosen the former because the latter required softness I no longer possessed. It's not over, the note had promised.
No.
No, it wasn't. But then again, neither was I. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, if you've listened to how I died and came back and destroyed the people who tried to erase me, then you know the truth. Betrayal doesn't just wound. It transforms. Changes you into something harder, colder, more capable of survival than the person who trusted too easily, loved too completely, believed too naively in forevers that were built on lies. Tell me in the comments. Would you have done what I did? Would you have walked into that wedding? Would you have let them live with their guilt? Or would you have demanded they face it publicly? And if you've ever felt erased by a lover, a friend, a family member who thought they could rewrite your story without you in it, know this. You're still here. Still breathing. Still capable of writing your own ending. Some storms settle inside you.
Make peace with that.
Become that.
Until next time.
On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. By the way, don't forget to subscribe. It encourages me to keep bringing more stories like this. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.